Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 25, Botswana. So today's drink of choice is kind of cheating because the specific tea I got wasn't from Botswana, but rooibos tea is very popular in Botswana and the region around it. And if I wanted to get an actual drink from Botswana, I'd have to pay like $90 for a 500 milligram bottle of ginger beer. I love ginger beer, but I'm not willing to spend $90 for a single one. So rooibos tea is a black tea that is commonly produced in South Africa. The traditional way is apparently with milk, but I prefer non-milk tea, so that's how I normally drink it. I actually really like it. It has a kind of earthy apple-like flavor. Not as good as chai in my opinion, but I still really enjoy it. Rooibos' popularity in Botswana is largely because it is found in southern Africa. It has South Africa to the south, Namibia to the west and north, Zambia just barely touching it in the north, and Zimbabwe to the northeast. Botswana is climate-wise mostly open arid grasslands. Depending on the time of year, it can get very wet, particularly in the areas in the northwest along the Limpopo River. Botswana, despite being roughly the size of France, has less than 2.5 million people in it. Most people are various Bantu peoples, with the Tswana being the dominant ethnic group in the country, with 79% of the country being Tswana. However, it should be noted that the Tswana are divided between roughly 8 tribes, along with several other smaller tribes, and as you will find out later on, not all members of a Tswana tribe are necessarily ethnic Tswana. Other Bantu groups are the Kalang, found in the northeast and make up roughly 11% of the population, and the Kalagadi, who are found in the southeast and make up roughly 2% of the population. Other non-Bantu groups include the San, who are the original inhabitants of the region, are found in the northwest, and make up 3% of the population, white Botswanians, who are often of British or Afrikaner stock, and make up another 3% of the population, and smaller groups of Indians, Chinese, and Zimbabweans. Language-wise, most people, especially Tswana, will speak Setswana, a Bantu language. It often serves as the chief language in everyday life and in traditional ceremonies or affairs. English is also commonly spoken in mass media and business. Other non-Tswana ethnic groups will often also speak their own language. Botswana is a mostly Christian country, with over 70% being Christian. Protestantism is the largest denomination, with over 65% being from some Protestant church, with Anglican and Dutch Reformed churches being quite common. Catholicism also has a decent presence, with 6% being Catholic. While officially only 6% belong to traditional animalist religions, many people often mix their Christian beliefs with traditional cosmology, with a syncretic Christianity often practiced. Other small religious groups include Muslims, Hindus, and Mormons. Irreligion is also fairly common, with around 20% holding no real religious beliefs. According to a DNA study, Botswana is apparently the place all humans originate from. So, Botswana is in some way the birthplace of all of humanity, if the study is correct. Botswana for hundreds of years was settled by the San Bushmen. The San are a collection of various people groups found in southern Africa. They live nomadically in hunter-gatherer societies, occupying large areas of western Botswana around the Kalahari Desert, subsisting off of large herds of animals found in the region. The San are particularly famous for the click sounds used in their languages. I would encourage you to look it up because it's actually really interesting, and if I try to replicate it, I will butcher it and destroy my already mediocre audio quality. Also, they apparently had a very egalitarian society and regularly used poisoned weapons to hunt. In the early first millennium CE, Bantu peoples began entering into southern Africa. These Bantu peoples tended to live in more sedentary societies. There were no written records in the country before the 1800s, so what groups arrived and their impact is a little unclear. But we do know that by the 1800s, the country was dominated by the Tswana, who divided themselves into tribes led by a Kosi, or essentially king of the tribe. Cattle will play an extremely important role in Tswana society. There's a saying in Tswana society: a man who has got cattle is a man who can talk. The Kosi would often be the ones who own most of the cattle, essentially renting it out to their supporters, who in turn rented them out to the average person, with the Kosi using their supply of large herds to enrich, or punish, their respective allies and enemies. Ultimately, society developed in such a way that those physically closest to the Kosi and their court would be at the top of the social hierarchy, while those who lived far away from them were at the bottom. These people who lived far away would often be ethnic minorities, like the San. These ethnic minorities were faced with either being pushed off their land, fighting the Tswana tribes who could wield fairly large armies, or integrating themselves into Tswana society, being used as servants to help tend the Kosi's cattle. The Kosi's power was based on their ability to defend their tribe, like any good ruler should. But notably, the Kosi also had a duty to ensure that prosperity existed for their tribe, and rule of law was present. I'm gonna hit you with another Tswana saying. Quote, "The law is blind, it eats even its own owner." So the Tswana valued Kosi who were not just competent military commanders, but also those who could listen to them. Tribal meetings encouraged tribe members to communicate with the Kosi and allow issues they had to be settled. Today, you can hear people argue that this was the start of democracy in Botswana, although I think it's a little more complicated than that. It's important to note that at these meetings, even today, it's extremely rare to find someone challenge the Kosi, unless the whole tribe backs them up due to fear of reprisals. In the mid-1800s, Europeans arrived to Botswana. They at first were British missionaries, bringing with them Christianity to the region. And despite not being colonized right away, Christianity took on fairly quickly in Botswana. The Kosi encouraged the conversion to the religion, both perhaps out of some genuine faith in Christ being the Son of God, but also to gain access to European markets. The Tswana were now able to acquire European goods, and most important of these would be guns. With guns, they managed to subdue rival ethnic groups in the region who encroached on their territory. One ethnic group who began encroaching on their territory would be the white Afrikaners. They had moved into northern South Africa and pushed into traditional Tswana-dominated areas. The Tswana Kosi feared being subjugated under the Boer republics and developed a close relationship to the British. There was at first talk among these Tswana of forming a confederation to counter the Boers and other peoples from taking over Tswana land, but this was eventually dropped. In 1885, Botswana was put under the control of the British in the Bechuanaland Protectorate in order to prevent further Boer expansion. For the British, this protectorate would serve as a bridge from their colonies in southern Africa to their colonies in modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia. And generally, the British thought that at some point the colony would just merge into the Cape Colony. However, in 1895, 3 Tswana Kosi arrived in London and petitioned for the British to prevent the merger into the Cape Colony. The Kosi feared that this merger would diminish their authority. The British decided to accept the offer, hoping that the Tswana could help them counter German influence in southern Africa. This move is probably what created Botswana today, as if it was merged into South Africa, it likely would have been just another province in the country. There's a quote I remember once reading about British colonialism that roughly said that the Brits' goal was to extract the most out of their colonies while investing in them as little as possible. And this is certainly quite true for Botswana. British colonial authorities largely left the country alone, and allowed the Kosi to keep much of their authority. Bechuanaland was seen as a colony that had essentially no natural resources of note, and the British saw no use in investing in such a poor territory. All they really asked was the Kosi provide for them some cattle, extract taxes from the population, and build a single railroad connecting South Africa to Zimbabwe. The capital of the colony wasn't even based in Botswana, but instead just across the border in South Africa. There would be some limited attempts to reduce the Kosi's influence in the 30s, but besides that, British colonial rule for the most part was very hands-off. Social structures in Tswana society remained largely the same. The British encouraged the Tswana to further assimilate ethnic minorities to achieve taxes and rent payments, helping create a population of non-Tswana, Tswana. White settlement was very limited, with colonial authorities agreeing to keep white settlers out. Christianity, while it had overtaken the traditional Tswana religious structures, also tended to blend the two religions together. There would be some religious conflict, as more Western churches competed with new churches set up by Africans. There would be some change, however, as tribal initiation rituals and polygamy were discouraged. One important change, however, would be the emergence of a small educated middle class. Now, this new educated middle class would not be very large, as no Western-style schools were built in the country, and I've heard the statistic that in 1966, only 24 people in the entire country held a university education. I'm unsure if this statistic is true at all, but this educated population, known as new men, began to emerge, often involved in the still important cattle industry. They promoted liberal values, such as free market enterprise and self-government, which clashed with the Kosi's conservatism. In this climate of new men emerged Seretse Khama. Khama was born the son of the Kosi of the Bamangwato, and became the Kosi at only 4 years old, although his uncle took over most of the duties of the Kosi. Khama would go to school in South Africa, and eventually in the UK, where he met an English woman, Ruth Williams, who he fell in love with. In 1948, the two were married, which immediately created problems. Apartheid South Africa did not want a powerful figure on their northern border participating in an interracial marriage, something that South Africa had banned. Khama's uncle also disapproved of the marriage, wanting the young Kosi to marry inside the tribe. The tribal leaders in South Africa both pressured the British government in London to either get Khama to divorce his new wife or renege on his Kosi status. The British government, needing South African resources, forced Khama and his wife into exile. However, Khama's uncle was unpopular as a ruler. His uncle was very repressive, and many hoped that Khama, if in power, would bring about a more liberal and tolerant society. Riots began in the country against his uncle, and the British interfering in the politics of the tribe. These protests, along with pressure from sections of the British public, eventually led to Khama being allowed to return to Botswana, but he would have to give up his status as Kosi. This had little effect on the mythos and character that began to be built around him. As Khama arrived via plane to the colony, it began to rain, an important symbolic event for the Tswana people. This would essentially be the equivalent of an American president returning to America from a foreign country on the 4th of July, and a bald eagle flying over to sit beside them as the national anthem and fireworks go off in the background. By the early 60s, it was clear that decolonization had arrived in Africa, and it became fairly clear that Botswana would become independent. But the big question was, who would run it? There were essentially three groups vying for power. The first two groups ultimately were fairly weak, with limited public support. First were the Kosi, who wanted a Botswana that essentially was the exact same. They would be in charge, and Botswana would be a federation, with each Kosi given their own bit of land to rule. Keeping the status quo was not desirable for many, so their support was limited. Next were the various leftist/pan-African groups. These groups did have some support among the Tswana, who frequently worked in South Africa, and made connections with the African National Congress, who were fighting the apartheid system in South Africa. These groups opposed racism, capitalism, the rule of the Kosi, and wanted a more socialist Botswana. Both the Kosi and the British strongly opposed this group coming to power, so they intentionally sabotaged these groups, and made it difficult for them to operate and grow. Khama himself led the third force. Khama opposed the British and the Kosi's rule in Botswana, but sought a middle ground. He believed racism and tribalistic tendencies needed to be stamped out among the Tswana, and aimed for a more moderate nationalism. The British liked when he denounced communism, promoted liberal ideas, and argued for Botswana not to be antagonistic towards South Africa. Khama's personal popularity helped propel him and his new party, the Botswanian Democratic Party, or BDP, to victory in the 1964 colonial elections. In 1966, Botswana would become independent, with Khama becoming the country's first president. Botswana's first task after achieving independence was trying to find a way to expand the economy. Botswana entered the world as one of the poorest countries, with no infrastructure, little educational structures, and was thought to have only limited natural resources. Cattle, like in pre-colonial and colonial times, was turned to as an industry to make the country. With the BDP investing heavily in the industry, they had an interesting mix of encouraging entrepreneurial spirit and innovation, while also regulating and nationalizing the sector, and spending millions into it to help expand and provide for rural communities. The government made it a goal to ensure every community had drinking water, and built roads to connect the country. Urbanization would increase, as the capital was moved from outside the country. The city of Gaborone was built as a capital of the country, and is where a large chunk of the population currently lives. Botswana would begin to economically grow, once large diamond reserves were found in the 70s. The main diamond mining company, tswana, is owned by both the government and the De Beers Company, with both owning 50% of the company. The result of the government controlling half of tswana is that it provides a massive source of revenue and also allows for taxes to be fairly low in the country. This allowed the government to invest heavily in itself, and today it's one of the fastest growing economies in the world, with a relatively high GDP and HDI for Africa. Tourism has also helped grow the economy, with a lot of the beauty of the country and the many animals that inhabit it being popular draws for tourists. However, it also should be noted that this increase in GDP also resulted in a rise of economic disparity. There's been a growing gap between the richest of the rich in the country and the poorest of the poor. Poverty is very much present in the country, and for some rural parts, finding a good-paying job can be very difficult, and space to raise a family and cattle is becoming smaller and smaller for all, except the richest in the country. Government welfare projects have attempted to ensure that wealth trickles down, but these have had mixed success. Politically, the BDP has run Botswana almost as a one-party state. There are free and fair elections in the country, but every single election from 1965 to 2019 has seen the BDP win again and again, with it never receiving below 46% of the vote. This, depending on who you ask, might be because the BDP has run the country incredibly effectively and has been very successful incorporating traditional Tswana authorities and systems into their government. Therefore, the average Botswanian is very supportive of the government. According to the opposition, it has more to do with the main opposition being weakened in the 60s by colonial authorities, corruption and nepotism in the BDP, and the BDP abusing and misusing traditional Tswana authorities and systems to promote themselves. The BDP in relation to the Kosi generally have a fairly positive relationship. They tend to align with each other, and the BDP allows the Kosi to hold on to a lot of spiritual and advisory power. There have been sources of tension, though. Control of tribal land, which is controlled by the government, can create problems. The role of corporal punishment is also a source of tension, with some Kosi advocating and participating in flogging campaigns. No, this is not a kink, but it is where the Kosi and their supporters will whip either alcoholics or migrants from other countries. Botswana is a very Tswana-dominated country, if you couldn't already tell. Most of the major players in the country's history are Tswana. This ethnic homogeneity has benefited social cohesion, as it is debatably what has helped contribute to the relatively stable political climate in the country, as Botswana hasn't had to deal with elites from other ethnic groups attempting to take over the country, and thus starting a coup or a civil war. However, it has also produced racism within the country. Many ethnic groups, who, if you remember, were forcefully assimilated into the Tswana tribes, have had to deal with being treated like second-class citizens, being discouraged from marrying pure Tswana, and discouraged from using their first language in public. The San people, in particular, have had to deal with threats to their way of life, as the government had forced them into a sedentary lifestyle. In the 90s, minority rights activists began protesting for greater rights for their community, their elites to sit on an advisory body, the House of Chiefs, and to be respected. These groups have had seemingly little success. You can still find human rights groups condemning the Botswanian government's treatment towards the San, but for groups like the Kaligati, it seems they have achieved the greater respect they were looking for. But also, I'm not from Botswana, and the information on this was limited, so I suppose take all this with a grain of salt. Importantly, the 90s protests against Tswana-centric viewpoints, along with corruption scandals in the BDP, and the rise in HIV cases in the country, led to a rise in the opposition. Today, the main opposition bloc is the Umbrella for Democratic Change, a coalition of several social democratic parties that won 36% of the vote in the last election, which still was 15% short of the BDP's 52%. Other opposition parties include former President Ian Khamas, the son of Saritsi Khamas, BPF, the Liberal Alliance for Progressives, along with some small communist, liberal, and Trotskyist parties. Also, another reason the 90s saw greater opposition towards the BDP was the murder of Segamitsi Mogomutsi. Mogomutsi was a 14-year-old girl who was killed with various body parts removed in an apparently ritualistic murder. The case today remains unsolved, and there apparently is a fairly widespread conspiracy that government officials and/or rich elites were responsible for the murder, or at least covering it up, claiming that these elites partake in rituals in order to gain influence in the government or society. How true it is that some elites partake in murder of some sort is something up for debate, and I'll admit I don't really have a firm grasp on the validity of the conspiracy, but importantly, it has resulted in greater electoral gains for the opposition and protest against the government. Also, it should be noted, I got all this information from the book The State and the Social State Formation in Botswana, which is not written by a David Icke conspiracy theorist type, but instead a sociologist who spent time in Botswana. It's honestly a really good book if you want to learn more about the country, and I would strongly recommend you read it. The current president of Botswana is a BDP member, Mohaitsa Masisi. He has been president since 2018, and has had to deal with division in the ruling party, as some have accused him of authoritarianism and corruption, which he often throws back at his opponents. He notably has called for reduced regulation on elephant hunting, which has caused protests from animal rights groups. So why does Botswana exist? Botswana exists because, quite frankly, it asked to be. It didn't want to join in with the other colonial projects built around it. The Tswana wanted, and still want today, a place where they feel they are in control. While there certainly are problems within the country, they have largely found a way to be successful and have prospered. Botswana is not the paradise it is sometimes presented as, but it is still a fascinating country with a very colorful history. Up next, we go to a very large country far west of Botswana. We will go to Brazil. So prepare for the Portuguese, an empire, multiple republics, a couple civil wars, some coups, and some smooth bossa nova. Thanks for listening, I hope you enjoyed. So right now, what you are probably listening to, if I can get it all right, is the Botswanian national anthem. I figured I'd try to throw in some music in the outro, just to make it a little bit more exciting. YouTube has been telling me no one watches this section of it, so, I figured why not try something. I'm really sorry it took so long to get this episode out. I was, and still am, swamped with homework. I just have, essays I have to write every single week. But a break is coming up for me, so hopefully I can get a couple episodes out before I have to go back to school. Next, I'll have an episode on Romanian political parties, and then Spanish political parties, and then I'll do the history of Brazil. So yeah, thanks for watching. My email is whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, comments, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I use for this episode are Africa World's documentary on Botswana, BritMonkey's video, How to Make a Country Rich from Scrap, Exploring Africa's page on the history of the San, Geography's Now video on Botswana, Michael Beach's video on Gaborone, MMEGI Online's article, Masisi, Fight Divides the Nation, Mr. History video on Botswana, New Africa's video on Seretse, Planet Explorer's video on Botswana's economic miracle, Science Alert's article, New Study Finds the Ancestral Homeland of All Humans Alive Today, the book The State and the Social, State Formation in Botswana and its Pre-Colonial and Colonial Genealogies, by Ornulf Golderbranson and Nernulf Golderbranson. They're Norwegian, so sorry I can't get the names right. And then finally, Wikipedia.